Martin Cordiner. That's okay. Okay, my name is Martin Cordiner. I'm from the College of Optometrists. I'm the head of research at the college. And this study, Prevalence of Visual Impairment in Dementia, we handle the acronym the PROVIDE study. Now, of course, it should be the Prevalence of Visual Impairment in people with dementia, but that doesn't work for the acronym, so we stopped with that one. And in short, essentially what this was a project funded by the National Institute for Health Research, undertaken by us, the College of Optometrists, led by my boss, Mike Bowen, the Director of Research, who's the big fellow at the back, who will be on the panel later on. It involved academics in optometry, neuroscience, statistics, organisations like the Alzheimer's Society, Thomas Pocklington Trust, a national recruiting network, a national domiciliary optometry company, a huge number of very kind carers, family members and people with dementia. So that's the short version, this is the longer version. So firstly I just wanted to mention that although the college is actually based in London, I actually grew up in Birmingham and I have some photos to prove it. So this is Bourneville Village in the snow. So it's from my dad's own private collection. They'll be available for purchase later on if you like. Next up is quite an old photo of Birmingham City Centre. So this is the town hall and this is where there is now a fountain. You might agree that it probably looks a little bit better now. Now there's no proof that this picture is actually taken in Birmingham. I will concede that. But it is proof that I did actually have a natty Christmas jumper tank top long before they became popular. So feels important to prove. So here's the disclaimers, any connection to people that you know is purely coincidental, etc. etc. So how is visual impairment defined? So of course there's a lot of different people I know in this room from different backgrounds, so apologies if at any point I'm teaching you to suck eggs, etc. But essentially there's sort of two commonly used definitions, which is visual acuity in the better eye worse than 612 or worse than 618. So for those who don't know, 6.6 is what is generally termed normal, so that means that you can see at 6 meters what you would expect to see at 6 meters. So 612 means that you're seeing at 6 meters what you would expect to see at 12 meters, and 18 is at 18 meters. So basically your vision is worse than normal, for want of a better phrase. So this is an example of this. So this is the 6.6 line, so at 6 meters, you'd be hoping to see this, and if your vision was not quite as good, then this is the 6.12 line, and this is the 6.18 line. So that's what it might look like if you can't see the 6.6 line and you're struggling between 12 and 18. So the primary objectives of PROVIDE that we'll discuss today were these: to measure the prevalence, or how much visual impairment there was in the people with dementia that we looked at, and to compare the prevalence of visual impairment in that population with the prevalence of visual impairment in the general population, insofar as we had the data to talk about that, but we'll come on to that. And then thirdly, to identify ways to improve eye care for people with dementia, insofar as that was possible. There's some secondary objectives as well, one of which was to identify any differences in the prevalence of visual impairment between people living in their own homes and people living in care homes, because the project actually looked at both and was relatively unique in being able to do that. It's worth pointing out that that wasn't actually an original aim of the study. We thought it might be possible, but it depended, but because in the end of the numbers we were able to get, it meant that statistically we could actually look at that. And also to estimate the percentages of people with dementia likely to be able to perform successfully key elements of the eye examination. I think that's quite important because there is this perception that maybe people with dementia can't do these things, and so that was interesting to look at as well. So in terms of what the study actually looked like, it was in two stages. So there was the prevalence study, and then there was a qualitative study. So the prevalence study involved 708 participants with dementia, aged between 60 and 89 years, and you can see there's roughly sort of 50-50, not quite, but 389 in their own homes and 319 in care homes. Originally it was aimed to be about the same, but it was slightly more of a struggle to get quite as many in care homes, and based on the statistics it was actually not really a problem. And again, as has been pointed out, 2/3 live in their own homes, so the numbers didn't really have to be quite equal. A full domiciliary eye examination by an experienced optometrist was attempted on each participant. So we went into their homes, we went to the care home. We did give people the possibility of coming into a practice, but no one wished to take that up. And when we say experienced optometrists, we do really mean that. We work with a specialist domiciliary national company called the Outside Clinic. Their average patient age that they see is somewhere in the region of 82. and the average sort of length of time they have for an examination is about an hour. So they specialise in people who are elderly, many of which will have dementia. So it wasn't what you would call, shall we say, a standard eye examination on the high street. Each participant's level of cognitive impairment was also assessed by the standardised mini mental state examination. Now, this was not to see whether they had dementia, because every single person involved in the project had a diagnosis of dementia, so we knew that that was the case insofar as that diagnosis, but this was a way of getting a proxy, just a proxy for the degree of dementia within the individual seen. So that was the prevalence study, and the stage 2 was a qualitative study, so we spoke with people with dementia, their carers, both professional and family, and optometrists, in order to talk about how they perceived issues dealing with eye examinations for people with dementia and all of the issues and barriers they might have perceived around it. So within the data that I'm about to talk about, there's these 3 definitions which it's useful to know. I've written them down on a big piece of paper because I can never ever remember which one's which. But essentially you have presenting visual acuity. So this is where the participant was visually impaired when wearing their current distance spectacles, or if they didn't have any. So when the optometrist turns up, they either have a pair of spectacles which are not good enough and they're visually impaired, or they don't have anything at all. Then you have post-refraction, or best corrected visual impairment. So this is where the participant was visually impaired even when wearing up-to-date prescriptions. So the optometrist has come in and said, okay, you need slightly different spectacles, but you're wearing them and you're still visually impaired. And then uncorrected or undercorrected visual impairment is where the participants who had presenting visual impairment who were not visually impaired when wearing the up-to-date prescription. So basically they get the spectacles and that improves their vision. So whether they're helped by spectacles or not, essentially. So this is the data. So you can see that we have for 612 and 618, so for the 2 definitions, you can see that generally, obviously, there's fewer people with slightly worse vision, which I suppose we'll say is a good thing. And in terms of these 3 definitions, you can see that when presenting, there was about a third, and then about half of that, the number in red, was corrective to spectacles. So of the people who had a visual impairment, once they were given spectacles, either because they didn't have any or when they were given correct spectacles and up-to-date prescription, their visual impairment went away. So almost 50% of the presenting visual impairment was correctable with up-to-date spectacles. And how do these add to what we already know? So, as I say, the project was about looking at the prevalence, but also aiming to compare that to the general population to see how it compares. Now, this data is useful because previous UK prevalence data is at least 15 years old, only reliable for presenting VI because lots of these studies don't necessarily have an eye examination, so they can't tell you what the situation is after they've been refracted, i.e. they can't give an up-to-date spectacle prescription. So they might say this person can't see, but it might be because, well, if they had the correct glasses, they would be able to see. So that's one of the things that the provider was able to do. Previous data has also not had very much about care home residents, so we did that too. And it's rarely separately identified participants with dementia. So we have data that we compared ours to. We had to fiddle around with all the different data to make it match, because the way that another study measured it in terms of age or the population, correcting for age and gender and all sorts of things, meant that we had to sort of fiddle with the data. But it means that the prevalence was this 28.3 compared with 33.5 in Provide. So we found slightly more prevalence in our population, but not by loads, and it's slightly different, the figures, depending on if it's 612 or 618, and depending which study it is and things like that. So overall, we found, yes, there was slightly more prevalence in this population, but not by huge amounts, between sort of 4, 5 and 10%, but it was up and down a little bit because of these different factors, which I'm hopefully outlining vaguely clearly. And the care home residents as well was 24% in previous studies as compared with Provide's 44%. It's worth saying, sorry, that those figures are for everybody. So when we compare care home residents with those living in their own homes, you can see that visual impairment of all types, so it's not just spectacles, this could have been pathology and cataracts and all that, which we'll come on to, was 2 to 2.5 times more common in those living in care homes. And in particular, the prevalence of undercorrected or undercorrected VI was statistically significantly greater in those living in care homes when adjusted for these things. So remember, this is the one where spectacles does the trick. So if it wasn't spectacles, what was it? So for the people for whom, after they'd had the spectacles, they were still visually impaired, what caused it? As you can see, nearly half is cataract, and there was also about a third age-related macular degeneration, and then these other things as well. It was perfectly possible, of course, that one individual participant would have more than one of these things. Might need spectacles, they might have cataract, might have all sorts of things. But where a single cause had been identified, and that's what it was. So, to cover the ability to carry out key elements of the eye examination in people with dementia, one of our secondary aims, but one thing that's probably actually very important to know, and the interesting thing is that most key tests were possible in over 80% of the participants. So, in over 90% as well, the key tests of tonometry, eye pressure to check for glaucoma, and examination of the eye with an ophthalmoscope were also usually possible. So a lot of carers, as we'll come on to, a lot of people might think, well, someone with dementia can't do these tests. You need to say, is it bigger, is it smaller, is it 1, is it 2? No, not necessarily, because you have objective ways of measuring, and most participants were able to experience these tests. Now, of course, everybody is different, and we'll come on to that as well. But in most people, they were able to do these tests. Those unable to do it were significantly more likely to live in care homes and significantly lower SMMSE scores. So again, it depends on the individual clearly. So one of the other strengths that the study had was also to look at both near and distance vision, which a lot of other studies haven't previously done. And for people of this age, near vision can be extremely important. So what we found is that 16.2% of participants could not read standard newspaper-sized print with their current reading spectacles, but almost 2/3 of those could when they had the correct spectacles. So if they were given spectacles that they didn't have already, or that prescription was improved, then they could be reading this, whereas they couldn't before, so making a difference to people's lives. And near vision loss, again, significantly greater for those living in care homes after corrected for age and gender, so again, the care home thing coming up. So that's covered in a whistle-stop tour the Prevalence study. Now to talk briefly about the Qualitative study. So this explored participants, and when we say participants, people with dementia, carers, both professional and family, and optometrist views of eye care for people with dementia. So 36 interviews with people with dementia, 33 family carers, 5 focus groups, 34 optometrists, 5 focus groups, 16 care workers and professional care workers. Ideally, we wanted a few more focus groups, but in the end, because the people were so busy and it's hard to sort of get them involved, interviews just seemed like the better way to go in the end. So in terms of the views on eye examinations, most participants had actually had regular eye tests and were generally satisfied with them. I think we probably all agree that you're generally satisfied unless you know there's a problem or you perceive your lifestyle or eyesight to be degrading badly. But the general agreement that they're important, but the carers are unsure about how much of the eye test is possible. So again, they may have been sure about that even within a study that is demonstrating that the majority of the time it is perfectly possible, especially with the most important tests. And also that the optometrist pointed out that often they're not actually informed in advance that the person they're about to test has dementia, and this can often be the case even when someone is attending with a family member or with a carer. It's just not sort of felt relevant to mention, whereas for an optometrist it would be extremely relevant, maybe for all sorts of reasons, not least to do with the environment and for the amount of time taken and all these sorts of things that would help. And therefore, of course, the presence of an informed carer, not just a carer, but an informed carer who knows some of the history of the person they're actually with, is invaluable. So in terms of domiciliary eye care, optometrists probably want more information, training and guidance on examining people with dementia. So every optometrist is obliged to provide a domiciliary eye examination, but what normally happens is you end up with specific companies who provide those services. And I think optometrists would probably suggested that they want more information about that side of things. Most of the interviewees, as well as family carers, were actually unaware of the availability of of domiciliary eye care for people with dementia before the study. I think there's this perception that domiciliary is about if you can't walk, it's about if you can't get out. But it's really just if there's any reason why it's more suitable for you to have it in the home. And obviously if someone has dementia, where the situation might be better in their own environment, they might feel more relaxed, all those sorts of things, then that becomes useful. And the domiciliary exams within the PROVIDE study were perceived as more thorough, not rushed, less stressful than other examinations that they might have had in the past. But we probably expect that. It's worth adding that the outside clinic have extremely rigorous audit procedures. They have extremely rigorous ways of ensuring that the tests are suitable for whoever they're seeing, because so many of the people they're seeing are of this background. So the views on spectacles and spectacle wearing. People with advanced dementia are often reluctant to wear spectacles. Interviewees often said spectacles were not needed. There's a feeling that this might be partly because with people with dementia might be in their head going back to times before they actually needed spectacles, and so they just, and missing or broken spectacles can often be an issue, especially for people living in care homes. It can be useful to label glasses with the name and the purpose. This was all sort of expressed as sort of, sad anecdotal stories of desks being pulled out just full of spectacles. That's obviously not really helping anyone. And it's good practice to minimise change when dispensing new spectacles. So at the same time as suggesting that you can improve someone's quality of life, the individual obviously needs to be considered, because if the change is small, then you need to factor in to what extent is this actually useful. Views on cataract surgery are quite interesting. So as we saw, half the people who, for whom spectacles didn't do the trick, had cataract. That was the reason they couldn't see. And the interviewees said that they would have cataract surgery if advised, but there were mixed views from focus group participants. There's a sense, I think, essentially in which some people think, okay, it's good if we can sort them out in that way, but the discomfort when, the consent issues, all these sorts of things, suddenly make it complicated. But when asked, would you favour earlier than usual cataract surgery, the individuals thought that they possibly would, supported by family carers. Optometrists are generally in favour, but then they, issues of, well, would it happen in my area? The way the healthcare system works start to come into it. So, to get towards conclusions, approximately 1 in 3 participants were visually impaired for VA worse than 612 definition, 1 in 6 for the 618. Almost half of that presenting visual impairment was correctable with spectacles. Approximately 50% of visual impairment not correctable was caused by the cataract, and the disproportionately high prevalence of visual impairment in those living in care homes should obviously be addressed, because that's clearly a thing. Key messages for practitioners: this could be, optometrists, carers, just anyone who isn't the person with dementia, essentially. People with dementia and their carers benefit from more information regarding availability of domiciliary eye examinations and the eye examination itself. Again, they can do the tests. That is okay. It should be tailored to meet the needs of an individual, and the optometrist would welcome and could benefit from further training on dementia and the examination of people with dementia. It's worth adding that the college has a number of regional events that we take across the country, and we've had lectures from people talking about these issues. Some of the people involved in the project have come and spoken to our members, so we are hopefully spreading the word. In terms of more messages, carer being present and providing advice regarding cognitive abilities can be very helpful, but it's important to remember that the carer's wishes may not necessarily coincide with those of the actual patient. And things like the time of day and the environment is obviously important as well, more important for these individuals possibly than other individuals. And just for anyone who is interested from the perspective of doing further research in this area, or was interested in maybe how we like to think it went quite well, we thought that having public and patient involvement at all stages, including before the things start in the planning, was extremely useful, and we're very thankful to the Alzheimer's Society and Sue Maskell involved in the project and allowing that to happen. We also had what we called an informal consultee system, so where someone did not have the capacity to consent, you had a formal consultee who was able to say, okay, this is okay. But we also had an informal consultee, so even where someone could consent, we wanted someone involved in the family or someone that knew the individual to say, okay, yeah, I think this is fair enough, this is okay, it's an eye examination, all right, that's okay. Again, that could be a bit of trouble where they disagree, but at the same time, it just made everyone feel a bit safer and a bit better about what we were actually doing. Establishing personal contact with care home managers is useful for people who are extremely busy and trying to make sure that you capitalise on their goodwill but lack of time. Planning and reviewing all communications from the perspective of patients and carers is a good way to ensure that one party, who are largely researchers, don't fail to recognise how a letter going out to people with dementia needs to be written a certain way, call it an eye test, eye check rather than eye examination, etc. Is a good way to make sure that everyone stays happy with the general goings on of the project. And also to aid with that, we had a wonderful central coordinator with the project, Rosa Pepe, within the study team, who managed to manage these competing priorities. Excuse me. As you can see from my introduction, you've got academics, you've got optometrists, you've got a national company, you've got recruiters, you've got people with dementia, carers, families. How these people have different needs at various points and they want to do things different ways, and a central coordinator balancing these interests insofar as possible is advised. So I'd just like to say a special thanks to the Dendron recruitment teams. They're the people who made recruiting to the study very possible, the outside clinic, all our wonderful participants, the people involved in the project, Professor David Rakishar and the big man Mike, who made these slides happen, and that's pretty much your lot of funding.